Friends and colleagues, I'd like to warmly welcome you to this event commemorating the 5th anniversary of the National Apology for Forced Adoptions. I'm really glad to see you all here. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would like to acknowledge some of our VIPs here today. Sue Pennicue, Member of Parliament, Penny Mackison, Chair of Vanish, from ARMS, Mary Meggett, Founder, Jo Fraser, Secretary, Dorothy Kowalski, Treasurer, and Faye Burnham, Convener. I'd also like to acknowledge Elizabeth Edwards from Origins Victoria, and Darryl Higgins, Director of Institute of Child Protection Studies at the ACU, Brenda Carman, CEO of Permanent Care and Adoptive Families, and Ange Karavidis, Manager of FIND. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone else here. Thank you very much for coming. Each of us has our own unique personal experience, and no two are the same. And there are some common themes and feelings, but there are also differences, and I want us to acknowledge those differences in the room today. You may well find that the presentations that we have today stir up some feelings about your own experience or about your views and perspectives. The issue of language can be sensitive. It's absolutely never our intention to offend or hurt anyone with our words, and so we would just like to say that up front, that is never our intention. We would just ask, if you do feel upset, please, if you feel distressed, please step outside, take a breath, and one of our support people at Vanish will be there to help you if you would like that. I really sincerely hope that this event provides you with an opportunity for reflection and healing. I'm going to hand over to my co-MC, Jo.
Thank you, Charlotte. On behalf of ARMS and Vanish, welcome to everybody. And I just want to read out a few apologies. We've had quite a number, but a short list of them is Jenny Makakos, MP, Bridget McKenzie, MP, Fiona Patton, MP, Daniel Andrews, Premier, Georgie Crozier, MP, Patrice Evans, MP, Lizzie Blanthorne, MP, Faye Cuff, Sue Kemsley, Lynn Kinghorn and Jenny Worrell. We are videoing today's event. The video recorder is over there and it's just recording the speakers. But if anybody does have a problem with any of that, please just come and have a chat with me afterwards. Now, on the 21st of March 2013, I was present in the Great Hall of Parliament House in Canberra when Prime Minister Julia Gillard apologised on behalf of the Australian Government to people affected by forced adoption. The Great Hall held more people in it than it had ever before, many of whom are in this room now. Julia began by saying, "Today this Parliament, on behalf of the Australian people, takes responsibility and apologises for the policies and practices that forced the separation of mothers from their babies, which created a lifelong legacy of pain and suffering." It wasn't just an apology, but an acknowledgement of the ongoing distress and trauma that those policies and practices caused to all involved. I have the great honour of presenting a video message commemorating the 5th anniversary of that apology from Julia Gillard, AC.
Today we commemorate my apology on behalf of the Australian Government to all of those who were hurt by the practices of forced adoption. It's 5 years ago today that I delivered that apology, and it was one of the most moving and important moments of my Prime Ministership. Unfortunately, I can't get around the country today to everyone who is having an event to commemorate the apology, but I do want you to know my thoughts are with you as you take a moment to reflect on what the apology meant to you and to those you love. Today, this Parliament, on behalf of the Australian people, takes responsibility and apologises for the policies and practices that force the separation of mothers from their babies, which created a lifelong legacy of pain and suffering. We acknowledge the profound effects of these policies and practices on fathers, and we recognise the hurt these actions cause to brothers and sisters, grandparents, partners and extended family members. We deplore the shameful practices that denied you, the mothers, your fundamental rights and responsibilities to love and care for your children. As Prime Minister, I had the great honour of delivering the apology, but the apology only came about because people had the courage to tell their stories and to demand change, and in particular to have their hurt acknowledged by the Australian Government and by the Australian community. So really, the voices, the courage of individuals that led to the apology on that day need to be recognised. And I know that people are still continuing to show incredible courage on their own journeys of healing, but also advocacy for services and supports that are necessary, and also advocacy to make sure that we never forget this history. I want to acknowledge every individual who is still raising their voice, and thank you for doing so. For me, I remember the day of the apology very, very clearly. It was a day of some significant political events elsewhere in Parliament House, but my focus was very much on the individuals there in Parliament House who had come to tell me their story. Before I went to deliver the apology, I was able to meet with a number of individuals who could tell me what happened to them, and it's their voices that really propelled me through the apology. I could feel from the crowd what it meant to the individuals in the room, and knowing that the emotion was so high in that room also made me realise just how much of an impact the apology would have for so many more beyond the room. Not just for those directly affected, but for everyone in the chain of family and friends who had felt the impact from these events. As I move around Australia, I do get stopped by people who want to talk to me about the apology. They might recognise me in an airport or when I'm walking on the street, and some will come and tell me some very personal details about themselves. But a very common thread across that, and also the emails and letters I still get in my office, is that the apology in and of itself made a difference. For people to feel that they had been respected, that their voices had been heard, that they were no longer being required to hide away, that this wasn't a question of personal shame, but of community acknowledgement of the wrongdoing by our nation through forced adoptions. This has come through to me very powerfully from individual after individual. I've even received an email from someone who was overseas at the time of the apology, but for whom the apology meant a great deal. So I'm very conscious that this continues to have an impact in people's lives. I think the key messages in the apology are that as a nation, we've always got to be prepared to look in an unflinching way at our past. And when we see a wrong, we've got to be prepared to recognise it, name it, and then act to redress it. With forced adoptions, I think we learned some lessons that we all needed to understand. We learned some things about informed consent. We learned about the depths of the bonds between a mother and her child and between a father and his child. We learned that when we try and not tell people the truth about where they've come from, that can cause hurt and dislocation for decades. And we learned too that when something wrong happens, it's not just an individual who suffers. That pain and hurt flows through whole families and whole communities. We also learned some things about the power of identity and knowing where you came from. And I hope that we continue to keep those lessons at the forefront of our minds. Australia's a wonderful country, but what makes us stronger for the future is when we're prepared to look in a clear-eyed way at our past, and when we've fallen short of the mark, when we've done things that are wrong, to be prepared to apologise for those things and learn the lessons for the future. I believe as a country we were strengthened on the day of the apology. I believe that we can take that strength forward into making sure that we do learn lessons about how best to look after each other. I do think words matter. I know that there might be some cynics who say, well, at the end of the day, a statement in Parliament House is just a statement, it's just some words. But I do think words have force. They can mean a great deal in people's lives. I think the attitudes as a nation we show can be caught by very formal statements like the apology for forced adoptions. But words do also have to be married with actions. And I think we have seen, since the day of the apology, a different recognition and different spirit around forced adoptions in our country. I hope that it has become a little bit easier for people to tell their stories. I hope it has become easier for people to reach out and find help. And I also hope it's become a little bit easier for people to find each other.
Jessie, did they change your name? So you all know who I am. Oh, Jessie, where are you, darling son? You are taking...
My best wishes to everyone who is attending commemorative events around Australia today. Today is such an important day for the entire Australian community, a moment on which to reflect not only on the suffering and pain, but also the strength and advocacy that led to the giving of the apology for forced adoptions. My very best to all of you.
I'd like to express our gratitude to the Queensland Forced Adoption Support Services team for their initiative in arranging this video we've just viewed, and also to the Forced Adoption Support Services team in South Australia for their role in organising it. We are also, of course, extremely grateful to Julia Gillard AC for taking the time to present such a thoughtful and heartfelt speech. The day of the apology is firmly etched in my mind as a momentous occasion which brought comfort and healing to many of those attending. As Jo said, the Great Hall was completely full. The event was emotionally charged and many tears were shared. When the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard delivered the apology, the entire hall fell into silence so as to hear her every word. The wording of the apology was spot on, and I commend Adjunct Professor Honourable Naim Mashin, who's here today, and the Apology Working Group for their contribution to getting the wording so right. It did not shy away from the reality of what occurred, the manipulation, mistreatment, and malpractice. It named the coercion and practices that were unethical, dishonest, and in many cases illegal. It involved taking responsibility and apologising for the forced separation of mothers from their babies, which created a lifelong legacy of pain and suffering. It acknowledged the struggle with identity, uncertainty, and loss. The speeches in Parliament after the apology were also profoundly moving. Some of the people present that day had fought long and hard for their experiences to be validated and for the government to take responsibility for unethical and often illegal practices of the past. They advocated on their own behalf and on behalf of the many others they knew were affected, some of whom are no longer with us. They were remembered that day and we remember them now. There was also betrayal that day with an attempt to take over leadership from Julia Gillard. Yet throughout the apology, she remained focused and composed. That this leadership spill took place on the day of the apology was distressing and disappointing for many. The sudden switch of media attention from the apology to the internal politics of the Labour Party was really heartbreaking for many, dashing their hopes of increased public awareness, understanding and compassion. There have been other betrayals too, particularly the push by the federal government promoting adoption from out-of-home care, i.e. without consent. This indicates that lessons have not been learned and that the concept of never again is lost on some policymakers. These betrayals can demoralise us, or they can make us stronger and more determined to ensure that the mistakes and crimes of the past are never repeated. One of the positives from the apology is that it created connections that previously were not there. New friendships blossomed and new groups formed and are making their voices heard alongside those groups and organisations that have been advocating for decades. This is particularly the case in the adoptee community, which is more organised today than it ever has been. I want to talk briefly about the concrete measures that the apology brought. Julia Gillard's government committed $11.5 million to a range of services for people affected. $5 million for the Department of Social Services to improve access to specialist support services. $5 million for the Department of Health for improved access to psychological services and the development of guidelines and training materials for mental health professionals, and $1.5 million for the National Archives of Australia to develop the Forced Adoptions History Project. 5 years have passed, so we would expect to be seeing some positive results from these measures. What are they? This question is actually very difficult to answer because there's hardly any information publicly available. For the $5 million that went to the forced adoption support services, we do not know the extent to which people affected have been properly supported. Counselling does not yet seem to have been included in those services as had been expected and hoped. A review was recently undertaken of the programme, but it's not yet clear whether the results of that review will be made publicly available. We do know that the small grants under the forced adoption support services have brought positive outcomes. The provision of grants to peer support and advocacy organisations has brought tangible benefits to people affected. For example, healing retreats and healing events for mothers, art therapy programs for adoptees, and the stunning Mother and Child Monument in Sale, Gippsland, organised by the Independent Regional Mothers. For the $5 million that the Department of Health dedicated to training psychologists and counsellors, again it's difficult to find any information about the outcomes for people affected. We know the training programme is well developed, but we don't know how many people have been trained and what the resulting benefits have been for the people intended to benefit. I understand that our keynote speaker might have some information to share with us about this. The $1.5 million for the National Archives resulted in a carefully curated exhibition called Without Consent, which has been touring Australia and educating the public about the coercive ways in which mothers were separated from their infants and the lifelong effects of these immoral and often unlawful acts. Without Consent has not come to Victoria yet. Vanish has written to the Director of the National Archives requesting that Without Consent be brought to Victoria and tour the entire country, not just select states. We sincerely hope this occurs so that awareness can be raised here in Victoria. So in reality, the scorecard is unclear. The lack of transparency over what has been delivered and to who raises questions that need to be answered. All government funding is taxpayers' money and should therefore be accounted for. Furthermore, this is apology money. It is specifically for those people who were and are affected by forced adoptions. We urge the relevant government departments to make this data available and to be accountable. It is our dear hope that we keep this issue on the agenda of the leaders and policymakers, that people affected are not forgotten, but instead are provided with the appropriate support to meet the needs of each individual. For each person's healing takes a different path and requires different resources. We know there are many individuals affected by forced adoptions who have managed their grief and loss, who are resilient and determined to overcome their traumatic experiences. However, we also know that many of those affected at some point in their lives need support. Every day, Vanish receives calls and visits from individuals seeking assistance to deal with the lifelong consequences of separation. We also know there are many more who do not know that there are services there that they can reach out to, or who are not able to reach out for whatever reason. We're concerned about them, and we're determined to continue to raise awareness so that they too might be able to come forward and be supported to heal. In finishing, I'd like to sum up by saying that the National Apology for Forced Adoptions was a remarkable event that profoundly affected many, many Australians. It is an event for us to be proud of and for us to commemorate. We would like to thank everyone who has advocated for the individuals and families affected, every person who shared their experiences through the Senate inquiry and through other means, in order for the politicians to truly understand what occurred. We admire your courage in doing this and recognise the challenges associated with the need to keep doing it. We'd also like to thank each and every one of you here attending this event today. We know that too takes courage. Vanish would like to hold a similar event to this in 5 years' time to mark the 10th anniversary of the apology. We sincerely hope that when we come together then to reflect on the remarkable events of the 21st of March 2013, we're able to also report more positively on the outcomes from the post-apology funding at that event. Thank you. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Mari Megget, founder of ARMS, who's also going to speak to you today.
It was so glorious to see Julia again, didn't you think? It sort of warmed my heart. Apart from the fact that I wanted to cry, it was great. This presentation has been contributed to by other members of ARMS, and in particular Jo Fraser, who has been a driving force in our organisation for some years now. I want to start at the end of one journey and to flag the march that is on for the next journey in this saga of a society blinded by a presumption that anyone who is infertile is entitled to be given a child. And so the following heralded one journey's end, 21st of March 2013. We deplore the shameful practices that denied you, the mothers, your fundamental rights and responsibilities to love and care for your children. You were not legally or socially acknowledged as their mothers, and you were yourselves deprived of care and support. To you, the mothers who were betrayed by a system that gave you no choice and subjected you to manipulation, mistreatment, and malpractice, we apologise. We say sorry to you, the mothers who were denied knowledge of your rights, which meant that you could not provide an informed consent. She was following in the footsteps of the Victorian Ted Baillieu, who on the 25th of October in 2012 said, "We express our sincere sorrow and regret for the health and welfare policies that condoned the practice of forced adoptions." The important thing about these two apologies, and the thing that they had in common, was that each government acknowledged that a system had been set up by society to take away our most precious creation, for most of us, our firstborn child. What is it about a system that makes it so persuasive? It is the combined might, the authority, the absolute power that comes from the joining of the state, the church, the legal system, and through them, all the services that devolve from them: doctors, nurses, social workers, lawyers, judges, priests, teachers, schools, psychologists, and ultimately our own families. When I was pregnant and in need of support to help me with the beginning of my family, I was up against the combined might of the state, and I was a teenager. And as well as that, I was up against the emotional weight of the judgment and expectations of my parents. So when Julia and Ted Baillieu, on behalf of all those institutions, acknowledged that governments, society, had conspired and colluded to take my child, ensuring that I had no right to raise my baby, I can truly give meaning to the fact that the personal is political. The terrible truth is that my experience was replicated thousands of times in many women's lives, and so while I just spoke then in the first person, I know that I am by no means alone. But that is the impact of a systems approach. Girls and women, we, were systematically stripped of our right and our opportunity to raise our child. We were not given the dignity of being acknowledged as mother, and we were cajoled and manipulated by weasel words like, if you really loved your child, you'd give it away. Well, that was nearly 40 years ago. I was a girl then, I have to say. The age is catching up. And that 40 years ago, I took what was my own very personal experience and I converted it into political action. I spoke publicly about the loss, the grief, the betrayal that inserted itself into every part of my being when my child was taken. And over the years, thousands of women have joined me to declare the truth of their motherhood and the terrible cost of the loss of the opportunity to raise their child. Doing that provided a very different knowledge to our society. It was a knowledge that challenged the status quo. It encouraged and allowed people to wake up to the realities of our experiences and to recognise what had happened in the name of society was indeed a travesty. Today, we have gathered here to remember that moment when the system acknowledged that it was wrong and that what had been done to us and to our children was indeed a great evil. Governments around Australia said that they had subjected us to manipulation, mistreatment, malpractice, coercion, and a brutality of practices that were unethical, dishonest, and in many cases illegal. Those are strong words. They acknowledged the grief, the loss, the disempowerment, the stigmatisation, and the guilt. And they said that they were sorry. That was profound, and it was a truly deeply moving experience for me, and one that I will never forget. But there's something else that we ought to remember today as well. That it was because of our work, because of all the mothers who raised their voices and refused to remain shamed and silenced, all those voices who spoke of the impact of adoption practices on their lives, that we have this apology, this incontrovertible evidence that we did not abandon our children, and that the system betrayed us and them. Our personal experiences, made public, created the political impetus for a monumental social change. That is the difference that individuals can make, and I'm really proud to be here standing amongst my friends and my colleagues in recognition of what together we have been able to achieve. In truth, the personal is political, and I thank Julia and the Australian Government for its acknowledgement of their role in our pain and our loss. It did truly represent the end of one journey, that of recognising the role of the state in the betrayal of its citizens. The truth for us, however, is that we must continue to live that loss, because it is a lifetime experience. And that brings me to that march, that second journey that I mentioned in the beginning. Whilst all of that was happening at a national and a state level, there was an explosion of cases of couples commissioning women in developing countries to have a child for them. Here in Australia, we are currently seeing a powerful and well-financed group of legal, medical and high-profile people who have a vested interest in the outcome, lobbying intensely all our governments to ease the current legislation around so-called altruistic surrogacy and to allow for commercial surrogacy. The surrogacy business is a multi-million-dollar business, and it is currently being held at bay by legislation in most states. But only just. ARMS has had a strong policy against surrogacy since we met with the first American surrogates, Elizabeth Kane, Mary Beth Whitehead and Laurie Jean, back in the early 1980s. It was through their advocacy that we realised that at the centre of every surrogacy is the relinquishment, and that for so many women who enter such an arrangement, they experience the same trauma that we did. They certainly began their pregnancies very differently to the way we did, with high hopes and expecting to undertake an act of giving and love. But for many of them, like us, they had no idea that it would feel so different to the fairy tale that is promulgated by surrogacy agencies to be separated permanently from the child to whom they gave birth. Birth mothers in surrogacy arrangements are in an even more invidious position than we were, if that is possible, as they are required to enter into a contract before they're even pregnant. It is an implied consent, and the legislation around Australia, although not allowing commercial surrogacy, provides very few protections to the birth mother. In general, the legislation reads like a formula to protect the interests of the commissioning couples, ensuring that the commissioned child is in fact handed over. As we know from the adoption chapter, a woman cannot anticipate her reactions, nor her responses during the pregnancy and after the birth of the child, even if she has previously had a child. As with adoption, the system makes it appear that giving one's child away is somehow reasonable, it is somehow normal, and that being a surrogate is a good thing, just as it was for us a good thing to give our children to these people who are so much better equipped to look after them. The very significant difference between adoption and surrogacy is that here is a child being deliberately created to meet the requirements of the commissioning couple. It is impossible to argue that such an act is in the best interests of any child, a tenet that has been central to the protection of children in our modern society. The truth is that at the core of surrogacy is the trading of babies. In Australia, we are now creating a new generation of grieving women, the next party of women and children to whom the state will owe an apology. The fine and reassuring words that Julia gave us, and the promise made by her government on behalf of future governments and on behalf of the people, will be empty for this next generation. It is beholden on all governments, in the name of what we all now know, not to be seduced by money, by the famous, by the bleeding heart of infertility. Governments, on behalf of the people, must remember that our children deserve not to be created as a commodity to meet the desires of a rightly saddened but self-centred couple or individual who feel entitled to a child at whatever the cost. Events like this commemoration are significant. They provide us with an opportunity to reflect on our history and to look forward to the future. They reassure us that things can be better, that governments can make humane and thoughtful responses when faced with the knowledge of the lived experience of their legislative decisions. It can feel bleak when faced with the prospect that we will wittingly repeat the failures of the past. But Julia and the premiers of all of our states have given us hope and a pathway forward. They have acknowledged and regretted a social policy that went horribly wrong. We do have that lesson in front of us. We have the knowledge that will help us avoid another round of guilt, shame, grief, and loss for mothers and children. It is our task, those of us who know this lesson, to keep our voices loud, to keep reminding the new governments, the next generations, that whilst surrogacy is seductive, it is not a journey to take. It will repeat a known travesty and reduce all our children to commodities. No parent, no government, no sound-minded society wants to think that we have provided some children with a barcode in place of a birth certificate. Julia's apology can give us the hope that this can be avoided. Thank you.
Charlotte and Maori for those wise words. In the lead up to the national apology, Attorney General Roxon established the Forced Adoption Reference Group, whose primary purpose was to draft the wording and the delivery of the apology. This reference group included 3 senators, 3 mothers, 1 father and 2 adoptees, and was chaired by the former Family Court Judge and Adjunct Professor of Law at Monash University, Naam Mushin. Much discussion was held between Naam and those affected by adoption throughout the country. As we all know, adoption is a very emotional issue, in which there are some differences of opinion. Naam ran his meetings in a genuinely respectful and sincere manner, but he tolerated no nonsense. One of the important aspects of the reference group was their acknowledgement of the fundamental importance of language, and we appreciated that a great deal. Of course, apologies must include concrete measures, so the Forced Adoptions Implementation Working Group was established, again with Naam as chair. Naam has advocated against adoption and surrogacy since then, and we are very grateful for his support. He is always ready to respond to a question or comment at a moment's notice, whether it's email, phone, however. It is a personal pleasure and an honour to introduce to you Adjunct Professor Naam Mushin AM.
Thank you. And may I start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people and the Kulin Nation, the original and traditional owners of this land, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. This feels like a homecoming for me. Vanish and Arms, and I see plenty of Origins people here as well, are people with whom I had vast discussions, many of them quite animated, I think you would agree, Joe. And I'm surprised that you would say that I don't put up with any nonsense, but it's not the first time I've had that allegation made against me. So thank you for your invitation to join you today on this one day after the 5th anniversary of the Commonwealth Apology to people affected by forced adoption. It's an occasion which was one of the most important events in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people throughout Australia, and a day which I'm sure we will all remember vividly and which will forever be emblazoned in our memory. I propose speaking a little of the events leading up to the 21st of March 2013 and then recalling the day itself and looking at where we've come to since then. Finally, you may be surprised to know that I propose looking at what lies ahead, and I suspect one or two things that I might say, while I think finding fertile ground in this audience are not generally commonly believed. The Senate Committee on Community References conducted its inquiry into former forced adoption policies and practices over a period of approximately 18 months and tabled its report on the 29th of February 2012. I've often spoken of the extraordinary work of that committee, and particularly Senators Rachel Seward, Claire Moore and Sue Boyce. The coming together of those three people from three different parties and the commonness of their direction and attitudes was something quite exceptional to behold. I read their extraordinary report about 6 weeks after it was tabled, and coincidentally 24 hours after that I received a telephone call from a senior member of the Attorney General's Department asking me if I would permit my name to be considered for appointment as chair of the Forced Adoptions Apology Reference Group. And I received a phone call from the attorney about 6 weeks later, and I was very happy to accept that. I've said to a few people even today that it was just as well that I didn't know how much work was involved in that exercise. I must say the Dean of the Law Faculty made all sorts of concessions to me to enable me to have the time that I needed to travel around Australia. I think it was twice for the apology and once or twice for the implementation, and it was really something quite special. You've heard of the structure of the reference group, and you've also heard about the matter of language. Our first job was to decide what language we needed to use. We lawyers think that language is really important. I've sat in court while people have analysed whether a word should be singular or plural, and it's always a very interesting thing. But the real thing about language here was, what word do you use for the person who gave birth to the child? It's absolutely as plain as the nose on your face. It's the mother. No adjectives. No birth mother, no life mother, no whatever mother. It's mother. And similarly, father. We regarded the terms adopted person and adoptee as being interchangeable, depending on their context. And it's used, those terms are used. And one of the easy bits about that decision was it was in accordance with what the Senate committee had recommended and what we put in the apology. I think probably one of the greatest honours that I had in this exercise was touring Australia, speaking to hundreds of people affected by forced adoption. As has been often said, as was said by Julia Gillard in that outstanding commentary we saw a short while ago, this whole exercise would not have been possible without the courage and conviction of those affected by forced adoption. I remain in awe of all who were able to undertake that daunting task, while at the same time recognising that there were many people who quite understandably and entirely reasonably, for one or other reason, felt unable or unwilling to do so. We know all too well the appalling treatment of mothers subjected to forced adoption. I don't need to repeat the details here. They fall into two categories. The first of those categories is the way mothers were treated, particularly by the institutions in which they were confined and in which they gave birth. The second is the lawyer's thing, about the documentation, the consents, the lack of guardians, the lack of independent advice, the lack of lawyers and all of those sort of things. And all of those things were nothing short of abominations, of a behaviour of a society which believed what it was doing was in accordance with the mores of the society. But it wasn't. When I first read that report, I can remember I was sitting at my desk at home. My wife was in the other room and she came running in as I said the word, "This is all illegal. It's a breach of the law. If consents are post-dated, if they're forged, all of those sort of things that we know about, it's a breach of the law. That's all there is to it." And that leads to one inescapable conclusion with the apology. That apology could not have been an apology without the use of the word illegal. It was a word over which I was prepared to go to the barricades. I think I told you quite a number of you who I consulted with about that. I was concerned that the government's lawyers would reject it because it would amount to an admission of liability leading to compensation. I'll return to that later. Fortunately, my concerns were unfounded. First of all, this was the view of the Senate. It was the view of everyone I spoke to on those consultations. It was the unanimous view of the committee. I put it to the attorney, she took it to Cabinet and came back and said, "Yep, that's okay." And at that point, I knew it was a really worthwhile exercise. And in fact, for all of you who were there on that day in the Great Hall, the word illegal got quite a reception, as it should have. By the way, the apology which we drew, we put aside all of the state apologies. We wanted to do our own thing. We had some research from Canada which told us what should be the structure of an apology. We spent hours poring over every word, every comma, every full stop of that document. And the apology delivered by the government was precisely word for word what we gave them. Let me turn to the day itself. I've watched that extraordinary speech on many occasions, most recently just a few days ago. It represents one of the outstanding moments of Australian history which must never be forgotten. That, together with the way in which people came together in grief and in hope, stands as one of my most vivid memories. There was a negative that day, wasn't there? Yeah. We can remember having lunch on the lawn in front of Parliament House as the word went around that a political challenge to Julia Gillard was on the way. It was a disgrace, absolute disgrace. That's patriarchy. I was one of the people who met with Julia Gillard that morning. She knew about what was going to happen later on in the day, and there was not the slightest indication of anything. It was an extraordinary performance by her. And let me give you a piece of information which I haven't previously disclosed until yesterday when I gave this speech in Brisbane. And that is that on that evening I wrote to Simon Creed. I told him that I thought his performance had been a disgrace, and I said that I thought he owed everybody an apology. I received no response.
Of course not. That's how patriarchies work.
Well, now we've heard about the concrete measures. We know that an apology can be only words, although I do agree that this particular apology, although you please forgive me for saying this because of what I had to do with writing it, but I think there was something special as far as the way people accepted this apology, reacted to it. And I think you can genuinely say that in a sense it stands on its own, but at the same time you need to put concrete measures with it. And we've heard about the concrete measures, including the National Archive, and there was some comment that the National Archive exhibition without consent has not been here in Victoria. That's true. The reason for it is that people who are going to put the exhibition on have to fork out some money in order to do it. In other words, you've got to pay the archive to put on its exhibition. I don't want to raise any hopes, but there are one or two things going on at the moment, absolutely no guarantee. Shortly after the apology, I was similarly honoured to accept the government's invitation of appointment to chair the Forced Adoptions Implementation Working Group. The membership of that group was very similar to the membership of the Apology Reference Group. As far as implementation is concerned, I think to the extent that they've gone, they've been reasonably successful, although I accept in particular what Charlotte said, that there's been no reporting and no transparency as to what's happened. What I am able to tell you is that as far as the training of mental health and like professionals is concerned, there are 3 courses. They're all online courses. Course 1 is an 8-hour online course which has had 1,626 individuals. Course 2 is for GPs and has had 57 individuals register for it, but I think quite a few of those GPs have done the mental health, the bigger course. And the course 3 is a general awareness of forced adoption courses, of forced adoption, which has had 995 hits or registrations. So a total of 2,678 people have in fact undertaken that course. The support services, in my view, are going moderately well. There's been a review, and quite rightly, as has been said, that there's been no results of that review. And I've spoken about the implementation of the training services. I had the pleasure and honour of consulting to the Australian Psychological Society when they were putting together that course. They did an extraordinary job, and that course, the 3 elements of that course are really quite something. I think that the National Archives has been one of the great success stories, subject to its travelling, as I've already said. It was launched by Julie Gillard on the first anniversary, and a great part of its success is the inclusion of the experiences of hundreds of people who were affected by forced adoptions. My experiences in forced adoptions have been amongst the most challenging and satisfying of my professional career. Apart from my admiration for the roles of people affected by forced adoption, which I've already expressed, the involvement of members of Parliament, health professionals, public servants and expert commentators and advisors has been absolutely exemplary. This has been an issue which has brought people together in a way which we seldom see. People have readily identified with those affected by forced adoption. It's only a pity that the issue does not have a higher public profile. So, what about the future? Funding has been secured until 2021, which was a renewal from last year of 4 years. Mental health professionals are availing themselves of training resources in larger numbers than expected. Peer group support, which I've always regarded as being fundamentally important, continues its excellent work throughout the country. But however, there remains considerable unfinished business. One of the crucial issues is the one of integrated birth certificates. While most states understand the need to produce some form of historical document containing all the relevant information, there's obviously some reticence in creating a satisfactory legal identity document. I heard, for example, yesterday in Brisbane of a difficulty with obtaining a passport, which is really a disgrace. There's been some slow progress on allowing adopted individuals to apply for a discharge of their adoption, and again there are one or two instances of that, but not many. But arising out of the divergence of opinions, it may be necessary to have alternative means of satisfying these demands. To my mind, there are three particularly demanding issues which require resolution. The first of them arises out of the word illegal in the apology to which I referred. Tens of thousands of people in our community have been significantly adversely affected by forced adoption. We know that that effect is multi-dimensional and intergenerational. We also know that the consequences on physical and mental health have all too often been disastrous. Now, it's the lawyer in me coming out, but if people act illegally, they are usually required to compensate somebody who's been adversely affected by those actions. Shouldn't the same proposition apply to those institutions which behaved illegal in the area of forced adoption? It really is time that this community looked at that and took it seriously. The second fundamental issue is one which was recommended by the reference group but rejected by the government. In order to give the issue of forced adoption a higher profile in the public domain and afford it a proper place in the nation's history, there should be an annual commemoration by way of a Forced Adoptions Day. We recommended it, they knocked it back, and one of the main reasons they said that they were knocking it back was that it was also Harmony Day. Well, all I can say is that I'm in disharmony with them. And I don't think that's a proper response. The third fundamental issue is a matter on which a number of you have probably heard me speak on quite a number of occasions. That's the whole future of adoption. The first thing is, if we're going to have adoption at all, having it in 6 different states and 6 different laws is a complete absurdity.
Yes.
That a child adopted in Albury and a child adopted in Wodonga should be adopted pursuant to 2 separate laws is a disgrace in a developed society like this. But there's something much more important, isn't there? And that is, should we have adoption at all? I've asked that question many times. I was particularly moved by the speech that was given a short while ago by Murray. I've just finished teaching a family law course to graduate students at Monash, and we had a debate, a discussion in the class. I told them about forced adoption. Not many people knew about it. We had a debate about adoption and surrogacy. I'm with Murray, and I suspect most, if not all, people here. I'm opposed to surrogacy. Certainly, international surrogacy is completely out. Any commercial surrogacy of any sort, whether it be international or domestic, is unacceptable. The potential for exploitation, the unawareness of the mother in entering into that contract before pregnancy as to what the reaction will be, and I agree, even if she's had a previous child, is completely unacceptable. And there's another thing. One of the things that really hit me in my travels around the country, I think I did 4 trips around Australia in 3 years in this exercise. Lots of frequent flyer points. The thing that really hit me was talking to adoptees about identity. We all want and need and are entitled to know who we are and where we came from, what our roots are. As a judge of the court, I've had children who've expressed a wish to have access to their children in jail, to their fathers in jail, even if they're murderers, because they want to know who he is. So the whole issue of identity for adoptees is absolutely fundamental. It applies to both adoption and surrogacy. But there's something else about adoption. You'll remember many years ago in family law we used to use the terms custody and guardianship and access. They were changed to an order for parental responsibility, an order that the child live with somebody and the child spend time with somebody. And the philosophy behind that change was that the original terms, as well as, in my view, adoption, contain an element of proprietorship of a child. And that cannot and is not in the best interest of the child. 40 years of family law tells me that. Now, as well as that, we have these appalling experiences of forced adoption. I think that the law that we now have in the Family Law Act with regard to the best interests of a child and the making of orders in the terms of the modern terms of that can answer all your problems with regard to adoption. I think it's time we moved away from adoption. Now, I can tell you that I believe I'm swinging against I know that I'm swinging against the current. I had a discussion with a prominent politician about this very recently, and I know I'm swinging against the current in all aspects of the political spectrum. But I think that there is a real lesson to be learned in all of that from our experiences in forced adoption. Thank you very much indeed.